Is you and Kelly and Jim are racing? I know what you're doing. Okay. That'll be next time. Okay. Well, I don't mind racing on a bike as long as it's all downhill. Yeah. So, sometimes you look back on things you did and you decided it wasn't very bright after you did them. So, it's the time I rode downhill in New Mexico mountains on my bike. After I was done, I was thinking I shouldn't have done that. If you've never been going 60, and I'm not exaggerating, 60 on a bicycle with the very narrow tires. And on one side, as long as I crashed to the left, that was into the mountain. But the other side, you could have fallen 100 feet or more down. Yes, for hours. That would have been a bad case of road rash on that one. Yeah. So I did just do it once. So. All right. Glad you're here tonight. And the ladies' weekend was successful. Everybody came back. You didn't leave anybody there? Okay. Good. And then we have rain today, so what more could we want? Clark, you want to word our prayer for us tonight? Is there any updates? I don't know anything fresh. I haven't talked to Jim Herndon this week. I think he's going to have a procedure at some point.
Yeah, she's doing pretty good. She's good. She says she's going to go on vacation to Pennsylvania. So.
She was here Sunday, so yeah, she was. So that was good to see. Yeah. Yeah, and she did do Erling was saying she did ladies' class. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Okay, Clark.
Heavenly Father, holy is your name. We are thankful, Lord, to be in your presence, to be studying your word. We pray for those who cannot be with us, who need to be restored to health, for Sue and Jim and Ann and Ralph, Buddy. We pray, Lord, that your hand will be upon them and that you'll give them comfort and strength and healing, and that you'll inspire us to be their family, take care of them. We pray that you'll open our hearts and minds tonight to your word, that we'll become better servants of yours. In Christ's name.
I'm sorry, but I just saw this sticker here. It says Oklahoma Sound Corporation. But underneath it says Clifton, New Jersey. So that just doesn't make sense to me. If it said Tulsa, that would make sense, but not Clifton, New Jersey. Okay. There are just some things I don't understand. Okay, 2 Kings, but we're not going to start in Kings. We're going to start in Amos tonight. We're going to try to weave in several of our prophet friends here. If you remember, we're coming to the end time of Jeroboam, the second. And then it's going to be his son, Zechariah. And during the long reign of Jeroboam, what was it, 41 years? North Israel actually was pretty prosperous. But this is what Amos had to say about that. Amos chapter 6, starting verse 1. Woe to those who live in ease in Zion, to those who feel secure on Mount Samaria. They think of themselves as the elite class of the best nation. The family of Israel looks to them for leadership. Now going down to verse 3. That's the background. Verse 3, he starts his case. You refuse to believe a day of disaster will come. Right? When everything's going great and you're making lots of money, hand over fist, bad days they're not coming. But you establish a reign of violence. Wait a minute, so you built it on doing violence. They lie around on beds decorated with ivory and sprawl out on their couches. They eat lambs from the flock and calves from the middle of the pen. I'm not a rancher, so I don't know what the significance of the middle of the pen is, but apparently it meant something. They sing to the tune of stringed instruments like David. They invent musical instruments. They drink wine from sacrificial bowls and pour the very best oils on themselves. So the picture here, even though these aren't the things we may necessarily do, they were having a good time, right? They enjoyed themselves. They indulged themselves. Yet they are not concerned over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, they will now be the first to go into exile, and the religious banquets where they sprawl on couches will end. Party's over, right? That's the idea. Even though they don't see it coming or want to believe it, Amos's word is, it is coming. So that's the backdrop, and I don't want you to get lost in this. Maybe you'll just take my word for it, but there appears to be in the historical record, and it's convoluted, it's hard to get your mind around it, but the point's going to be the same. There appears to be an 11-year gap between the end of Jeroboam's reign and when Zechariah, his son, actually takes over. It doesn't point that out in Kings, but if you go back and do the dates and read a bunch of stuff, they're pretty confident there was at least some kind of gap there. Because you remember how Jeroboam died? Assassinated, right? So it's not very far-fetched to think in terms of civil war, right? There were factions that were playing against each other, and it took Zechariah a little bit of time to establish himself and have enough strength, enough backing to be named king. And for me, we're in chapter 15, verse 8, that explains this verse. Jeroboam's son Zechariah became king over Israel. He reigned in Samaria for 6 months. To me, that makes sense. If there was just, whether it was a few days or even a few years, the turmoil, and so even when he becomes king, things aren't settled, right? There's still a lot of factions that seem to be fighting, and we're just going to have a lot of that, because after 6 months, we are told it was long enough for him to be said that, he followed after the first Jeroboam, not just his father. In verse 10, Shallum conspired against him. He assassinated him in Ibleam and took his place as king. Okay? If we think about things aren't settled, nobody is providing true spiritual leadership, even in the midst of some times that have been plentiful and they've had what they've wanted. It seems to be unraveling to me. And Shallum takes over. He became the king in the 39th year of King Uzziah. And if you thought 6 months for Zechariah was short, Shallum is going to reign for a month. So again, lots of fighting. He's not even king long enough to get the quote that said, and he committed the sins of Jeroboam. Nobody's thinking he's a good king, but he's not even long enough to get that said about him. If you read the text there, they just say, well, yeah, he was king for a month. And again, this was fulfillment of the prophecy for Jehu, 4 generations, and this last generation didn't last very long. Shallum was a departure from that, and now he's king for a month. And then Menahem attacks, killed him, takes his place as king. Look at verse 16. At that time, Menahem came from Tisra and attacked Tifsah. He struck down all who lived in the city and the surrounding territory because they would not surrender. So again, let's put this in this context. These aren't foreigners. These are other Israelis, other Israelites, because they wouldn't surrender to him because he just had a coup and took over. What does he do? 2 brothers. He kills them. And it's not just that. Look at the end of the verse. He ripped open the pregnant women. Now, that's not an uncommon tactic. If you look at Amos 1, the Ammonites, Amos 1 verse 13, because the Ammonites have committed 3 crimes, make that 4, I will not revoke my decree of judgment. They ripped open Gilead's pregnant women so they could expand their territory. This was a brutal way of enforcing your dominion over a conquered people, right? Spread terror. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Menahem is doing it to his own people. It's certainly gruesome enough for a foreign invading army to come in and use those kind of tactics. So, we see that there in Amos. But there's something different happening in Israel where they're now even doing those kind of awful things to their brothers who won't submit to their self-appointed authority. So this pace seems to be accelerating. They're reaching a point where there's nothing to go back to. There's corruption, there's disorganization. Keeping power is hard to do, and they're resulting to ruthlessness.
I mean, I don't understand doing something like that to extend his borders.
Yeah,
Couldn't use something else to.
exactly. An invading army, though, their hope is they can appear so ruthless. And that was the Ammonites. They were trying to invade. If you can get scared enough from them, people just give up and surrender rather than fall to the same thing, right? Where did he learn this tactic? Well, it had been done to them. And it's bad enough to do it to an enemy, right? But now he's turning it on to his own people who won't name him as king, and they're probably going, well, who made you king, right? You've probably said that to your children, who made you king? And rightfully so, but he at least had the military might to enforce it. Look, and here, just listen to this one, Hosea 7:3. Just to illustrate where they are as a country. The royal advisors delight the king, with their evil schemes. So one, they're making the suggestion, and king's like, yeah, that's a great idea. The princes make him glad with their lies. So again, it's just speaking to where Israel after, we're not quite to 200 years yet, but we're getting there. 200 years of going away from the Lord, this is where we find ourselves. And Menahem at least is going to bring a few years of stability. If you look in verse 17, he's going to reign for 10 years. He's king long enough. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not repudiate the ways of Jeroboam. So it's more of the same. And during his reign, verse 19, Pul, king of Assyria. So you have the Syrians just to the north, the Assyrians further north than that. The Assyrians are now ascending to more widespread dominance. So Pul, whose other name I prefer, his other name is Tiglath-Pileser III. I'm kind of glad he's the third. How would you like to be Tiglath-Pileser the first? Yeah, who came up with that name? At least you can say, well, that was my grandfather's name and my dad's name. If you want to shorten his name, you can call him TP the third. Tiglath-Pileser invades. And even though Menahem has gotten hold of Israel, he's not very strong. Look what he does. He paid 1,000 talents of silver to gain the support of Pul or Tiglath-Pileser, and to solidify his control of the kingdom, meaning his kingdom. So he's paying off Assyria, which at this point, that's good enough for them. And it also, with their backing, he's able to look like to be the man in charge. And how did he do this? Because 1,000 talents of silver is a lot. By taxing the wealthy men in Israel. Then the king of Syria left, and he did not stay there in the land. So how's that going to go over?
I wonder which of these actions can we have church growth?
Yeah, exactly.
I think we could study out of this and,
Well, sometimes you learn by learning what not to do, right? Yeah.
Or you knew not to do that.
Yeah, you would hope but apparently they didn't.
Like I say, I had this class before.
Well, what are we on? King, how many more we got? 2, 3 more? We're on about King 16. We got 3 more, so there's 19 kings of North Israel. So we're on King 16, and it's been the same story every time. They're not catching on. But Menahem passes away. Pekahiah, his son, replaces him as king. So at least there was enough stability. It passed from father to son, but it's not very good. Pekahiah in verse 23 only reigns 2 years. And verse 25, his officer, Pekah, conspired against him. They assassinate him, and then Pekah takes his place. So this is a brutal, just short time span. And can you imagine living in the country and every time you look up, there's a new king. Even under Menahem, at least you kind of catch your breath. But nothing is different. Pekah is going to reign for 20 years. And then go down to verse 29. Here's the thing about paying off a powerful king who's only getting more powerful. What's he going to do? He's going to come back, right? And 1,000 talents of silver is not going to be enough this time. He wants land. Look at verse 29. King Tiglath-Pileser came and captured Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Genoa, Kadesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee. including all the territory of Naphtali. So a complete tribe, their land's all gone. And he deported the people to Assyria. So Pekah's done. Hoshea conspired against Pekah, right? He's not a very good king if he's getting us deported, taken away. It's not stopping him. We're losing a good bit of territory. He assassinated him and took his place as king. It's got to end somewhere, right? Well, it is. Hoshea is going to be the end. The deportation has begun, and Israel is not going to be a sovereign nation any longer. But for a moment here, we're going to drop back down to Judah and check in on them and see how they're doing. What do you think? Well, as dark as it is in Israel, it's going to be just as dark, unfortunately, in Judah. Now, for a moment, it's not. Look at verse 32. Jotham becomes king. And it was said, again, they point out his mother was the daughter of Zadok. Who's Zadok? He's a priest. It sounds like medicine. If you get on the television and there's a new medicine called Zadok, we're not going to be surprised, right? It sounds like a pharmaceutical name. But I think it is instructive. I think the writer's trying to cue us in. The king marries the daughter of a priest. Is that a good thing? You hope it is, right? And it appears to be, because notice what first, and if you didn't know this, her name is Jerusha. Have you ever known anybody named Jerusha? Well, it came from the Bible. Sometimes you hear people's names, you don't realize it came from the text, but that's where Jerusha comes from. It says of Jotham, he did what the Lord approved. Finally, some good news. Just as his father Uzziah had done. Now, remember Uzziah, he started out good and didn't end up so good, but Jotham is starting out well. And then verse 35, there's that word, but. They still don't take care of the high places. There's still not total commitment to the Lord. And verse 37 says, in those days the Lord prompted King Rezin of Syria and Pekah to attack Judah. So even during Judah's good time, even though the king has some posture towards God, because they're continuing to have, I suppose, these high places, there's still some things that they need to look at, be reflective of themselves. So Rezin and Pekah come and attack, and we're told that Jotham passed away and was buried with his ancestors. And his son Ahaz replaced him as king. Finally, we make it to chapter 16. Ahaz, whose grandfather started out well, Uzziah, and whose dad, Jotham, started out well. For whatever reason, though, we immediately hear that Ahaz is not. He's 20 years old. Maybe his youth had something to do with it. But in verse 2 it says, he did not do what pleased the Lord his God, in contrast to his ancestor David. So while this turmoil is happening in the north, we're not quite to Hoshea. We backed up a little bit. It's during the reign of Pekah. Verse 3 tells us he followed in the footsteps of the king of Israel. You don't have to know what that, all you go is, okay, that's not good, right? Because we haven't had a good one there. Yeah. Well, and this is a how-to of not what to do, because everything that's now next mentioned is not on the list of things to do. He passed his son through the fire, a horrible sin practiced by the nations. See, one thing God never asked his people to do was sacrifice their children. That was pretty common, you understand. A lot of people did that. They would take their children, because what more example of devotion to a God could you have than to sacrifice your children? It doesn't make sense to us, but maybe on some level we go, that's pretty extreme, but okay. Ahaz is joining in with that. He offered sacrifices and burned incenses on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. So let's take a little excursion here. Let's go to Micah for a moment. Micah chapter 7. This is what Micah's report about Judah is. I'm going to start in verse 2 of chapter 7. Faithful men have disappeared from the land. There are no godly men left. They all wait in ambush to shed blood. They hunt their own brother with a net. How would you like this on your tombstone? They are experts in doing evil. They don't just do evil, they're experts. They're really good. Government officials and judges take bribes. Prominent men announce what they wish, and then they plan it out. The best of them is like a thorn. Their godly are like a thorn bush. Woe to your watchmen. Your appointed punishment is on the way. The time of their confusion is now. Do not rely on a friend. Do not trust a companion, even with the one who lies in your arms. Do not share secrets. For a son thinks his father is a fool. A daughter challenges her mother, and a daughter-in-law, her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are his own family. I don't want to live there, do you? This is not good. Everybody's turning on each other. But Micah says, I will keep watching for the Lord. I will wait for God who delivers me. My God will listen to me. Things look bad, but they're not over. Let's step back to this fact of Ahaz putting his son in the fire. That was practiced with the worship of Molech. Some people would call him a god, but I think a better term might be demon. Because you think about all the scary demon-like people that you may have seen in shows or something. Molech may be their inspiration. And one of the things that they would do is they would take a metal statue of Molech and they would heat it in the fire until it was red hot, and then they would take a living infant and they would place it in the outstretched hands and let him hold the baby. So, is that understandable on any level?
We're going to have to understand that story.
But that is where Judah, led by the king, is now finding themselves. Okay?
Yeah, I can see where the New Testament is the way it is. These are people back then that were able. I mean, they just were crazy. They just did anything. You put your son into the fire, and you're not murdering him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nowadays, you don't do that.
And they would do this and they would beat the drums in order to try to drown out the screaming of the child.
Back then, if you didn't want your child, that's the way to get rid of it.
Well, an infant, they sacrificed their children for what they thought would be their benefit. And even all the way back to Leviticus, chapter 20 of Leviticus addresses this very fact. So this is not a new thing going on, but this is now hundreds of years later. This worship is still being done, and they are being swept up into it. And if you go back and read Leviticus 20, it's very clear that Molech was particularly an abomination. Part of me can understand worshiping some gods if you thought they controlled that territory. But the extreme that you had to go to worship Molech is disturbing. At that time, King Rezin and King Pekah, remember that's where we started, and we interluded with this information from Micah, attacked Jerusalem. They besieged Ahaz. So it's not just random that the king of Assyria and the king of Israel were sent to attack Judah. I think it's because of his atrocities that he's being sent. Let's go to Isaiah 7 for a moment. And you notice we've already talked about Amos, Hosea, Micah, and now Isaiah, just in our short time tonight. I mean, God is sending messengers to try to get their attention, right? To provide warning, to wake them up. And notice what happens as Jerusalem. Now, Pekah and Rezin were successful. They conquered part of Judah. They just couldn't finish Jerusalem off. It was walled. It was well protected. Plus, I think God was trying to get another message across. So Isaiah chapter 7, we're going to start in verse 10. Well, let's start in verse 1. During the reign of Ahaz, King Rezin, King Pekah marched up to Jerusalem to do battle, but they were unable to prevail against it. So that's Isaiah's starting point. Now look at verse 10. The Lord again spoke to Ahaz. Ask for a confirming sign from the Lord your God. You can even ask for something miraculous. Ahaz, Isaiah says, I want to show you that we are not abandoned for God. Ask for a sign. Sometimes we think, well, we shouldn't ask for a sign. Well, he's saying, yeah, ask for a sign. So even something miraculous. Ahaz says, I don't want to ask. I don't want to put the Lord to a test. Right? To me, he's saying, I don't really want to know that. I don't want to know if the Lord's with us or not. He has his way of acting, his way of doing. No, that's not necessary. So,
Don't ask the question if you don't want the answer.
yeah. Don't ask the question if you don't want the answer. But God's going to give the sign anyway. Look at verse 13. Pay attention, family of David. Do you consider it too insignificant to try the patience of men? Is that why you are also trying the patience of my God? Are you going to wake up to what you're doing? You just don't even care? For this reason, the Lord himself will give you a confirming sign. Look, this young woman is about to conceive and will give birth to a son. Wait a minute, we know this story, right? You, young woman, now technically that doesn't mean virgin, it's more age than any kind of experience. You, young woman, will name him Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. What's even Ahaz, as detestable as his practice, God is still trying to get through to him. Let me give you this sign. And the sign will be this child. God is with us. He will eat sour milk and honey. Some people want to say yogurt. The idea is you're not going to have all your crops and everything. This is kind of travel food, fast food. You know, you can take curdled milk just about anywhere because it's already curdled, right? Honey, quick source of energy. So the idea here is, okay, times may get a little rough. This child, he's going to eat sour milk and honey, which will help him know how to reject evil. It's not actually the milk and honey. It's the hard times. Can help us understand what is good and what is not good. And help him, the child, choose what is right. This is why this will be so. Before the child knows how to reject evil and choose what is right, the land whose two kings you fear will be desolate. Okay, here's the sign. If you're watching, Jerusalem's not going to fall. In fact, these guys will be in trouble. Before this kid's old enough to know right or wrong. What do you think God's wanting him to come to the realization of? That the Lord did that. The Lord is willing to stand with him, but he's not going to just say, do whatever you want. He's going to expect a change, right, of behavior. The Lord will bring on you, your people, and your father a time unlike any since Ephraim departed from Judah. Ephraim is another way of saying North Israel. So in the last 200 years, you've not seen anything like this. And if you don't pay attention to this, the sign's going to be king of Assyria. You think it's bad with Pekah and Rezin? You ain't seen nothing yet, is what the prophet's saying. Look at verse 18. At that time, the Lord will whistle for flies from the distant streams of Egypt and for bees from the land of Assyria. What's the picture? What should flies from Egypt maybe conjure up? You might remember a plague or two, right? In case you've forgotten. Flies from one way, bees from the other. Guess who's in the middle? Is that going to be good? There's an old African proverb that says, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. Right? That's the picture I have here. That you're going to be smashed. All of them will come and make their home in the ravines between the cliffs and the crevices of the cliffs and all the thorn bushes and all the watering holes. At that time, the Lord will use a razor hired from the banks of the Euphrates, the king of Assyria, to shave the hair off your head and private parts. Again, shame and disgrace is the idea. It will also shave off the beard. So what sounded like maybe I don't know if this is the right word, a kind of a cute, hey, if you be good, God's going. No, the message from Isaiah is it's going to get really bad. and you haven't seen anything yet. Are you going to wake up to that? You don't want a sign? Well, God's going to send you a sign, and you're going to say, well, I didn't want to know that. Look at verse 22. From the abundance of milk they produce, he will have sour milk for his meals. Indeed, everyone left in the heart of the land will eat sour milk and honey. Because it's all going to be devoured by the flies and the bees. There's not going to be anything left. At that time, every place where there has been 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels will be overrun with thorns and briars. You think you're rich and powerful? You're not going to have anything. With bow and arrow, people will hunt, for their whole land will be covered with thorns and briars. They will stay away from all the hills that were cultivated for fear of the thorns and briars. Cattle will graze there, and sheep will trample on them. So what's Isaiah trying to tell? Yeah, there's this young woman sitting right there. Some think it may be his wife. Chapter 8, he has some children that he gives some pretty cool names to. We'll talk about that at some time. Maybe not. Maybe she was just in the royal court there, but she's either pregnant or soon to be pregnant. All of this stuff is going to happen. We're not talking about hundreds of years later. We're talking about months, in the coming months. And be reminded, God is with us. And that could be a good thing, or that could also be bringing judgment. This Emmanuel is going to be forced to eat sour milk and honey. But that hardness is going to help him see and be able to make right decisions. Choose something different than what this king is doing. How would this situation come about? How would it constitute a sign? Well, the first part is that North Israel and the Syrians are going to be defeated. But he's going to create a time unlike any since the time North Israel departed in the last 200 years. The Assyrians are coming. In the timeline, this is before Hoshea's people are taken off into captivity. Pekah's not going to know what hit him. And so this Davidic line in the south, just by their mere survival, not their abundance, but their survival is going to have to admit that God is with us. He's present with them during this Syrian-Israeli crisis, and he's fully capable of rescuing them, but he's also present in the judgment, disciplining them because they are yet to trust him. So I think the moral is pretty clear. If you're not going to receive God's promises by faith, what could be a potential blessing is going to turn into a disciplinary judgment, right? Your choices are going to matter. So let's go back to Kings chapter 16, verse 6. At that time, Rezin takes over Elat. We talked about Elat last week. So they've even gone around Jerusalem and conquered in the south. Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, saying, okay, he's been told by Isaiah there's bees coming out of Assyria. He has a decision to make, right? You hope he turns to the Lord and calls on him for mercy, but this is what he chooses instead. He gets in touch with Tiglath-Pileser and says, I am your servant and your dependent. march up and rescue me from the power of the king of Assyria and the king of Israel who have attacked me. So in his moment of choice, he goes with, I think I want Tiglath-Pileser to be my friend. But Tiglath-Pileser only becomes your friend with payment. You ever had those friends? I'm your friend as long as you're buying, you're paying. There's something I'm getting out of it. And here's what he gets, verse 8. Ahaz took the gold and silver that were in the Lord's temple and in the treasuries of the royal palace, sent it as tribute. The king of Assyria responded favorably to this request. He wasn't ready to invade Judah, but he would gladly take their money. He attacked Damascus, that's the Syrians' home, and captured it. And he deported the people to Kir and executed Rezin. When King Ahaz went to meet with King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, if we're thinking it's bad, it's only going to get worse. So hang with me just a couple more minutes and we'll stop. He saw the altar there. He saw King Tiglath-Pileser's altar. And why did he go to King Tiglath-Pileser? Because that's what you do when you're surrendering or saying, I'm your servant. You're showing submission. And he sent a drawing back home. They make a drawing, or they make the plans in Jerusalem that he sends back. Verse 12, when he arrived back from Damascus, he saw the altar, he approached it, and he offered a sacrifice on it. He offered burnt sacrifice and grain offerings. He poured libation, sprinkled the blood from the peace offering. He moved the bronze altar that stood in the Lord's presence from the front of the temple. You see where this is going? Not only did he just not follow the Lord, he's moving him to the side. He's replacing the worship of God with the worship of Tiglath-Pileser's God. So we'll pick up there next week. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And I promise next week we'll end Israel. We'll be done with them. If they're not already done, they're pretty close.
I'm about ready to cry for these people.
And I think that's the right response, right? 200 years and they never
I'm talking about,
turned the boat.
you talking about bleak. These cats have got it bad. The takeaway that I get is they might as well just shoot themselves.
If they're not going to use hard times to evaluate their behavior, they're wasting an opportunity, right? They never could, for whatever reason, see it.